Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on the channel today. I'm Ted Yacucci. Well, in part one of our series, Did Lee Oswald go to Mexico City? We said that the answer was no. We said that he had spent his time at the end of September and early October 1963 actually working to infiltrate Alpha 66 and the DRE and the other groups that had moved from Miami and were now headquartered actually in Oak Cliff in Dallas at that 3126 Harlandale Avenue address. And we looked at how Oswald had accompanied Bernardo de Torres and Edwin Black to visit Sylvia Odio and the efforts that they had done, De Torres and Black, to try to set up Lee Oswald as looking like a nut during that visit to Sylvia Odio. Well, what we're going to look at today is actually the trip to Mexico City and all of the shenanigans and craziness that the CIA and FBI were trying to hoist and foist on the American people about that supposed trip that really never happened. And we're going to start right at the beginning and kind of go through, and we're going to see if we really believe what those intelligence agencies were telling us about Lee Oswald. Okay, so for our video, we're going to use the actual report of the Department of State on Lee Harvey Oswald, and that also includes the FBI summary of the assassination of President Kennedy. According to official records, Lee Oswald was supposed to have arrived in Mexico City about 10 a.m. on September 27th. He checked in at the Hotel del Comercio. Oswald is listed as having stayed in room 18 at the hotel. Rooms 18 through 23 occupy one floor. The hotel clerk, Garcia Luna, examined the registry book for a period of Oswald's stay and was able to identify three of the guests who occupied room on the same floor during part or all of the period. He said he was able to identify these three because they frequently stopped at the hotel. Oh, this is great. There's only like five or six people on the whole floor, and three of them are identified. And they spent, what, 4 or 5 days with Lee Oswald on that same floor. Of course, they'll be able to identify him. Nope. Two of the three men identified by the clerk could not be found, and the third, Mr. Alfonso Ferez Fliego of Guadalajara, Mexico, stated simply that he frequently stops at the hotel when he's in Mexico City, that he was there during the period of September 26th to 28th in room 19, but that he did not notice Oswald's presence. And we know that a check of all records of the Mexican National Telegraph Company and all of the leading banks in or around Mexico City failed to show any money sent or received by Oswald under his real name or known aliases. Hmm. Well, that's strange. Well, we do know that Lee Oswald, after he got to Mexico City, he was almost immediately trying to arrange transportation back to the United States. So let's check that out. That apparently on both the 30th of September and the 1st of October 1963, Oswald went to the Agencia de Viajes to arrange travel accommodations from Mexico City to Dallas, Texas. And according to records of the agency, reservation and purchase order number 14618 was issued to the bus line in the name of Mr. H.O. Lee for travel from Mexico City to Laredo, Texas. Hmm. Well, that's a bold statement. Allow me to retort. The first word out of that paragraph is apparently. Now, apparently is one of those words that could mean a whole lot of things, but it first means that you don't really know what you're talking about because it should say, we're guessing. That would be a good way to put it also, wouldn't it? And then the other thing we want to take from that paragraph is that it was assigned to Mr. H.O. Lee. H.O. Lee. Well, let me ask you a question, okay? Just common sense stuff. If I was trying to hide my identity for some reason, would I just invert my name? Does that make any sense? What I would say is my name is John Smith, right? I wouldn't invert my name. The reason that name is inverted there is because intelligence agencies, the CIA, who was setting that up, wanted us to be able to still associate the purchase of those tickets with Lee Oswald. And they think that we're so dumb that we think that he's using some kind of espionage name that's so clever because he inverts his initials in his name. Ridiculous. Here's another rock solid piece of investigation by the FBI. They say that, as previously stated, our evidence is fairly firm that Oswald arrived at the bus station with one suitcase, a small zipper bag. Oh, yeah, well, that really closes the case, doesn't it? How about maybe giving us a little information about why you're saying he arrived with a small zipper bag? And it keeps going on and on. According to the official report, Oswald paid his bill at the hotel on October 1st, the payment including the night of the 1st. No one remembers when he checked out, but presumably it was sometime during the morning or early afternoon of October 2nd. Okay, so what we actually see is that nobody remembers seeing Lee Oswald in Mexico City. Nobody at the hotel. There's only a few people on his floor. Nobody remembers seeing him. Nobody remembers him checking out of the hotel. Nobody will know Lee Oswald was ever there, and we'll see that as we continue on. Okay, there's no proof. There's no solid evidence because he wasn't there. All right. Now, the important thing to know is that intelligence is trying to tell us, and the Warren Commission is that Lee Oswald was in Mexico City and trying to get to the Soviet embassy and apply for some kind of a visa or some kind of a way to get back to the Soviet Union where he would wanted to go return and live. Again, absolutely idiotic and ridiculous, but let's run through it, okay? So, in order to do that, the first thing that Oswald did was go to the Cuban consulate and talk to a woman named Sylvia Duran. Okay, now this is important because all of the stuff that's going to happen surrounding the so-called meeting will totally exonerate the idea of Lee Oswald ever being in Mexico City. The person that she's going to say it was and describe, it was nothing like Lee Oswald. The phone calls between the Cuban consulate and the embassy in Mexico City, the description of the person, Lee Oswald, will be nothing like the real Oswald. He will be identified as someone who spoke very, very broken Russian. Of course, that's not Lee Oswald because he spoke fluent Russian. But the big thing that we have to that we know here is that intelligence, the CIA, was so concerned about this woman, Sylvia Duran, because they knew that she could just blow up their whole false story, that what they did was the day after the assassination, they requested Mexican Secret Service to arrest the woman. And that was because they wanted to be able to get to her in order to give her a story that she would then later give to the press. So here it is again. On November 23rd, 1963, one day after the assassination of President Kennedy, the CIA's Mexico City station suggested to Mexican officials that they arrest Sylvia Duran. The Mexico City station asked that she be held until she told the Mexican officials everything she knew about Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is the most important part of Sylvia Duran's story. At the time of Sylvia Duran's detainment, Her pertinent statements about Lee Harvey Oswald were written by the Mexican government and given to Mrs. Duran to read and sign. So you can't underestimate what I just read. Win Scott of the CIA instructed his Mexican counterparts to arrest Sylvia Duran the day after the assassination, and they kept her for 2 days. And then they gave her her statements to sign. They also accused her of stuff that I won't even get into, but it actually went up to and even including maybe having a relationship with Lee Oswald. Unbelievable. And what does this remind us of? Well, it reminds us that intelligence, the CIA, grabbed Marina Oswald right after the assassination and kept her for weeks. They grabbed Howard Brennan, the supposed eyewitness who saw Lee Oswald in the window of the Texas School Book Depository. They kept him for 2 weeks. This is such primary evidence that the CIA was not only, doing all of the stuff that they were doing, but they were so out of control that, they had no reticence about even grabbing citizens and, forcing them to do their will. Now, we could spend a whole lot of time talking about all of Lee Oswald's supposed visits to the Cuban consulate and then the Soviet embassy, and then a repeat trip to the Cuban consulate, wondering why he hadn't heard back from the Soviet embassy. But here's what you really have to know. There were 3 photographic sites, and there was multiple multi-tap phone lines to both the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy. And not one picture of Lee Oswald or film would ever be shown or displayed. Not one phone tap of Lee Oswald, any audio recording, will ever be displayed. There is no photographic evidence of Lee Oswald having gone to the Cuban consulate or the Soviet embassy. There is no audio evidence of him doing either of those things either. So we don't need to get bogged down in the story of the malfunctioning cameras and this and that, and how the film probably had been, recycled or whatever they were using. It's all a lie. It's ridiculous. And we know it's a lie because ask yourself if there was any kind of evidence of any real nature that showed Lee Oswald in Mexico at all from September 27th to October 2nd from 1963. Don't you think after 63 years we would have seen just the smallest proof, the smallest iota? Of course, we haven't, because it doesn't exist and because the only photographic evidence was sent by the CIA of some ridiculous Lee Oswald imposter on the afternoon of the actual assassination. We don't really need to go further than that. Sylvia Duran's whole testimony about her conversations with Lee Oswald were written for her, and she was basically forced to sign. It's not a story that's really that hard to even understand. Lee Oswald did not go to Mexico City. What he did is what we talked about in our previous video. He was trying to infiltrate the exact Cuban anti-Castro Cuban groups who were going to assist intelligence and all of the conspirators in the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas. Thank you so much for being with me today, and I'll see you next time.